Elias Marsh was the only man in Antelope Valley who wouldn't sign the Baron's water contract, so his own neighbors laughed him off the church steps. They watched the clerk leave his mark off the paper, and 40 families cheered, and Elias did not argue. He only folded his hat. The Baron was Cyrus Vane. Cattle, land, 11,000 fenced acres, and a voice like a gate swinging shut. He stood in front of those 40 gathered families and said it plain. A man too proud for a gift is a man too dumb to keep his land. The whole co-op signed that afternoon. Every one of them. And Elias walked home alone past all that fence. That night, he went down to his own creek in the dark. He drove a stake into the bank. He lit a lantern and read one line of the contract he would not sign. Subordinate their appropriations, it said, in perpetuity to the company. He read it twice. Then he blew out the lantern and said only this: God help them come August. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe to the channel so these old valley stories keep finding you. And do me a kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this old valley travels tonight. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of it. Antelope Valley sat in the high, dry country of Colorado Territory, and the year was 1878. The town at its heart was called Ellsworth Crossing. A church, a store, a smithy, a schoolhouse with a bad pump. That was most of it. The rest was creek and grass and sky, and the grass was only green because of the water, and the water was the whole argument of the place, though most men there had not yet learned it. Elias and Ruth Marsh had proved up their 160 acres 11 years back. 11 years of it. They came in a wagon with a milk cow and a crate of hens, and not much beyond faith, and they broke the sod. And they held on through the years that tried to shake them loose. Now the ground was theirs. Patented. A deed in a tin box under the bed with the government's own seal on it. A man could stand on that ground and know no one could take it from him. Antelope Creek ran right across the middle of it. That was the luck of the Marsh place, and it was no small luck. The creek came down clear off the high country and crossed his patented ground before it ran on to anybody else's, and Elias held the oldest water right on the whole stream. He had filed it in 1871. First in time, the law said. First in right. He knew what those words weighed. Not many in the valley did. He was 54 that spring, a big-shouldered, slow-moving man with gray coming into his beard and hands that had done every hard thing a homestead asks. He was not a talker. He was the kind of neighbor a valley is glad to have and does not think much about until it needs him. And it had needed him, more than once. In the dry summer of '75, when half the creeks in the county went to dust, Elias opened his ditch and let his water run down to the Pruitt place and the Hollis place so their gardens would not die. He did not ask a thing for it. He mended the schoolhouse pump 3 springs running with his own iron and his own time, because the children drank from it and the town would not fix it. When old Mrs. Deaver's husband passed, Elias plowed her field before his own and never said a word about it in church. They loved him for that. They truly did. A man like that, you love him the way you love a fence post you lean on without thinking. Solid, there never in the way. Ruth was 51 and kept the household ledger in a hand small and even as printed type. She kept the faith too, hers and half the valley's, it sometimes seemed. She was the one who remembered birthdays and carried the covered dish to the sickbed. She wanted peace with the neighbors more than she wanted almost anything, and that was a good want, and it would cost her before this was through. One evening that spring she was setting the table and talking, the way she did, about small things, about the Hollis girl getting married, about the price of coffee at the store. And she said a thing without weight, passing it along the way you pass the salt. You'd know better than the lot of them what that paper means anyhow, she said. You used to copy filings at the land office before we ever homesteaded. She said it, and moved on to the biscuits. She did not know she had just named the thing that would save the valley. Neither did he, quite. He only grunted and reached for his cup. But it was true. Before the homestead, before the wagon, Elias Marsh had sat on a stool at the Territorial Land Office and copied water filings in a clean clerk's hand, week after week, year after year. He had read 1,000 of them. He knew the law of prior appropriation the way a smith knows the color of hot iron. He knew what a right was and what a promise was, and that the two were not the same animal, though they wore the same coat. He had put that knowledge away when he took up the plow. He had not thought he would need it again. He was wrong about that. The trouble came riding in on a fine day, which is how the worst of it usually comes. Word went round that the Vane Land and Cattle Company had an announcement, and every family was to hear it, and there would be a table set out at the church, with cake for the children. Cyrus Vane did nothing small. When he wanted a valley's ear, he bought it cake. They came from all across the flat, wagons and saddle horses and children running. 40 families or near it, which was most of the settled ground in the valley. They gathered in the churchyard, in the good spring sun, and Cyrus Vane climbed up on the steps where the preacher stood on Sundays, and he told them he had come to save them. That was the word he used. Save. He told them what they already knew and hated to hear, that the valley lived and died by rain, that a dry year could ruin a good man through no fault of his own, that out here a family was never more than 1 August away from loading the wagon and going back east beaten. He told it well. Every head nodded. Every one of them had lain awake on it. Then, he told them he had the cure. The Vane Consolidated Ditch, he called it, a great diversion dam thrown across the river up where it came out of the high country, and a master canal to carry the water down and spread it across the whole valley, farm by farm, in an even measure. No more praying for rain. No more watching the creek drop and the corn curl. Guaranteed water, he said. $3 the acre, every season, drought or no drought. A man signs once and never fears the sky again. You should have heard them. It went through that churchyard like a warm wind, guaranteed, every season, drought or no drought. To people who had buried crops and near-buried children over a dry July, it was the sound of salvation itself. Vane held up the contract, a long paper, close written. He read from it, but he read only from the top, where the promises lived. The dollars the acre, the measure guaranteed. The date they must sign by, which was before the June rise, so the company could begin the great work in time for the season. He read the sweet part, and he read it in a fine voice, and he did not read the rest. Because the rest was down at the bottom. In among the close lines a man's eye slides over. Clause 9. It was numbered. And Clause 9 did not promise anything. It took. In the plain hard words of the law it said that every family who signed would subordinate and convey their appropriative rights to the company. In perpetuity. Which is a lawyer's way of saying forever, and forever with no door in it. Nobody heard it. Vane did not read it, and if a man had somehow read it himself, he would not have known what it meant, because most of them did not truly know what a water right was. They thought it was rain. They thought a water right was just the wet stuff in the ditch, and here was a man promising more of it. So where was the harm? One pair of eyes stopped on that line. Elias stood at the back with his hat in his 2 hands. He had taken it off out of old habit, church ground being church ground. And when Vane held the paper up and the sun came through it, Elias, who read paper the way he read weather, found Clause 9 down at the bottom, and he went very still. He read it 3 times to be sure his eyes had not lied. They had not. He did not say anything then. It was not the place. But something went out of the day for him, and Ruth felt him change beside her, though she did not know why, and she took his arm. The table was set up inside the church, on the very board where they laid the communion cloth on Sundays. A bottle of ink, 2 good pens. And the contract, turned to the last page, where 40 families would write their names. Tom Hollis went first. Of course he did. Hollis was 40, loud, well-liked in the way loud men are, and he headed the settlers' co-op, so it fell to him to lead. He was a good enough man. He worked hard and loved his family and would have given you his coat in a snow. But he was a man who read the promise and never the price. He wrote his name big across the line, and he grinned, and the room clapped him, and that was that. The dam was as good as built. They lined up behind him. Neighbors Elias had known 11 years, men he had given water to in the dry year, men whose pumps he had mended. One after another they bent to the board and signed their rights away, and did not know it, thinking they had just bought rain. And then it was Elias's turn, near the last, and he did not bend to the board. He asked, in a plain voice that carried, if he might read a line of it out to the room first. Just one line. Vane, easy in his win, waved a hand. Read what you like, the wave said. There is nothing in there but your own good fortune. So Elias read Clause 9 aloud. He read it slow, and he read it whole, and then he set the paper down and told them what it meant in words a plowman could hold. To sign this, he said, is to hand Mr. Vane your water right. Your own right. The one that came with your ground. You will not have it any more. He will. And from that day you do not own the water on your own land, you rent it. From him. You become a tenant of your own river. The room shifted. Not much. A little. The guarantee, Elias went on, is only as good as his goodwill. Read it. There is no water promised in here that his word does not stand behind. And in a dry year a man's goodwill has no water in it. Goodwill does not fall as rain. When the river drops, the paper will say what the paper says, and the paper says, the water is his. For one breath it hung there. For one breath a few of them heard it. Then Hollis laughed. Not cruel yet. Just easy, dismissing. Elias, he said. It says guaranteed water right there at the top. Guaranteed. I can read that much myself. And the room grabbed hold of that word like a rope thrown to drowning men. Guaranteed. That was what they had come to hear. That was the word with cake under it. The rest was just Elias Marsh being contrary, the way quiet men sometimes were, jealous maybe that a bigger man had thought of a thing first. The moment passed. The heads turned back to the good part. Elias saw it go. He saw them choose the promise over the price with their own open eyes, and he understood he could not save a man who did not want to be warned. He set the pen down without touching the ink. I'll keep my own right, he said. It served me 11 years. It'll serve me yet. The clerk drew a line through the blank, where Marsh should have been. Vane smiled the smile of a man who has counted his herd and found it whole. That night, Elias went down to the creek. He walked the bank in the dusk to where Antelope Creek entered his patented ground, to the very mouth of his right, and he set his hand on the old cottonwood there. Then he took a chisel and a maul, and he cut into a new survey stake the thing that mattered most in the world and that no one in the churchyard had wanted to hear. He cut the date. 1871. The year he filed. The year that made him first. He drove that stake deep into the bank at the creek's mouth, deeper than a stake needs to go. The way a man drives a thing he means to have outlast him. The priority date, cut in cottonwood, standing at the water's edge in the last light. First in time, first in right. He stood a while and looked at the water going by, low and clear and his. God help them come August, he said again, to the creek and to nobody. Then he went up to the house where Ruth had the lamp lit, and he did not tell her the whole weight of it, because she carried enough. Vane threw a barbecue for the signers. He did it grand, the way he did everything, out at the edge of town where the church steps looked down over the flat. A whole steer turning. Fiddle music. Barrels of it. The 40 families came in their Sunday best to celebrate the saving of themselves, and the Marshes were not invited, and everyone knew they were not invited, and that was the point of it. But you could not cross town without passing near, and Elias had business at the smithy, so pass near he did, on foot, with Ruth beside him. And Hollis, warm with the day and the drink and the crowd's good cheer, saw them go by and called out so the whole gathering could hear, "There goes the proud man." Hollis said, and he laughed, and the crowd turned to look. "You'd sooner die of thirst with a full creek than take a neighbor's hand, wouldn't you, Elias? Too good for the rest of us." They laughed with him. 40 families. People Elias had watered in the drought. The laughter rolled down off those steps and broke over the two of them where they stood in the road. And then Cyrus Vane, up among his signers with a glass in his hand, gave them the line he had been saving. He said it slow, so it would land, so it would be remembered, so it would be the thing the valley said about Elias Marsh for years to come. "A man too proud for a gift," Vane said, "is a man too dumb to keep his land." The churchyard roared. Ruth's hand tightened on her husband's arm. Her face burned, not for herself, for him, and a little for herself too, God forgive her, because it is a hard thing to be laughed at by your whole world at once, and shame does not care whether it is deserved. She wanted to answer them. She wanted to shout that her Elias had given them water when this Vane was nowhere in the county. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that a laughing crowd would hear. Elias did not answer either. He looked up at Vane a moment, and up at Hollis, and at all those familiar faces bright with cake and certainty. Then he took off his hat, the way he had at the signing, and he folded it once in his big hands, and he turned Ruth gently by the elbow, and they walked home. Behind them, 40 marks on a contract. Ahead of them, an empty road and a low sun. Between the two, one hat folded in silence, which was the only argument Elias Marsh had left, and the only one that would matter, though not one soul there could have told you why. After that they were outcasts, and the valley made sure they felt it. There is no fence colder than a neighborhood's turned back. The co-op met and did not send word. Ruth went to church and found the pew beside the Devers had somehow filled before she reached it, and the greetings that met her were the thin kind, the kind with a wall behind them. Women who had eaten at her table looked past her at the coffee after service. Children take their cue from their parents, and even the children grew quiet when the Marsh wagon came. Ruth felt every inch of it. She was not a proud woman, and she had no armor for being made low. Some nights she wept where she thought he could not hear, and Elias heard, and it worked on him worse than any of Vane's words. A man can stand being called a fool. It is a harder thing to watch it fall on the one you love. Once, in that hard stretch, she came near to bending him. "Elias," she said one night. "Soft. Is it worth it? All of it? Could we not just sign and be done, and be neighbors again? What is one paper against all of them?" He was a long time answering. He knew the paper, she knew the people, both of them were right about the thing they knew. "It's not the paper I'm keeping from," he said at last. "It's what the paper does. If I sign, we're safe as neighbors and ruined as farmers, and we won't know it till a dry year comes and takes the water we handed him. I'd rather be laughed at with water than loved without it. I'm sorry, Ruth, I truly am. But I won't do it." She did not answer. She turned her face to the wall, but in the morning she made his breakfast the same as ever. And that was her answer. And it was enough. The valley found a new way to name him spiteful before the month was out. The great work had begun. Vane's men were surveying the master canal, the line it would take down through the flat, and the surveyed line clipped the far corner of Elias's patented ground. A wedge of it. The co-op voted, and the vote said the canal should cross that corner, for the common good, and Hollis rode out to tell Elias so, half order and half favor. Elias walked the line with him and looked at where it would run, and he refused. Not for spite. Because a company canal across his patented ground was a foot in his door and a claim against his own right, and he knew exactly how such a foot became a leg, became a whole man in your house, having read 1,000 filings where it happened. He said no. Route it around. It is my patent and I will not have their ditch on it. Hollis rode back and told it as proof. There, he said. The proud man again. Won't take our hand, won't give an inch, won't let the common good cross a corner he isn't even farming. Spite. Pure spite. And the valley, needing Elias to be small so their own choice could be large, agreed that it was spite, and hated him a little more, and felt righteous doing it. That was the second time. Each mockery had its own clause under it, if they had only looked. This one sat right on top of clause 9, and never saw it. And here is the cruel comedy of it, the part that would have made you want to stand up and shout at them if you had been there. The whole time, the audience of one that was Elias, and the audience of us, held the truth in our hands. Clause 9. Conveyed in perpetuity. We knew what August would say. They held a promise and thought it was the truth. We held the truth and could not make them hear it. That is the worst kind of watching there is. Knowing, and being laughed at for knowing. Elias did the only thing a knowing man can do. He made ready, quietly, and told no one. He rode into the territorial land office at the county seat, 2 days there and back, and he did not tell the valley why he went. He found his old filing in the great book, in a hand he half recognized as near his own from the old clerking days. 1871. Antelope Creek. Marsh, he had the register affirm it, current and good, and he paid the fee for a certified copy under the office seal, and he folded that copy careful into oilcloth and carried it home against his chest like a man carries something that could stop a bullet. He put it in the tin box under the bed, beside the patent, beside the deed to the ground, and in his mind he set it beside the stake at the creek. The stake in the earth, and the paper in the box. The right written where the water ran, and the same right written where the law could read it. 2 witnesses to the one true thing, laid up against a dry day he could feel, coming the way an old man feels rain in a bad knee. He did not gloat over it. He did not even feel clever. He felt tired, and a little sick, watching his neighbors dig their own hole with such cheer. But he had done what he could do. He had kept his right, and doubled the proof of it, and cleared his own house of any claim. The rest was up to the sky, and the sky was going to answer whether they liked it or not. Then the dam went in, and for a while it seemed the whole valley had been right, and Elias Marsh had been a fool after all. They built it fast. Vane had money, and he had men, and he had the June deadline, and by the time the snowmelt came down heavy off the high country, the consolidated ditch was throwing its great diversion across the river and running its master canal down into the flat, full and brown and generous. And 1878, whatever it meant to do later, began wet. The early water came abundant. It poured down the new canal and out along the laterals to farm after farm, and the valley drank it in. You never saw such green. The signers' fields came up thick and dark and even, watered by the measure, drought forgotten, and every man of them looked at his corn and looked at his neighbor and felt the warm certainty of a bet come good. Guaranteed water. There it was in the furrow. Vane had done exactly what he said. Wasn't a man in the valley now who didn't tell the story of the barbecue with relish, the day the proud fool wouldn't sign. Because there was Elias, off on his patented ground, still watering the old way. Still running his one-hand dug ditch off his one creek, with his one old right, a thin brown thread of a thing beside the Fat Company Canal. His fields were fine. But they were no finer than theirs, and theirs had cost no worry and no sweat over a headgate, only $3 an acre and a signature. So why had he made such a stand? Why the hat folded, the long walk home, the shame he'd put on poor Ruth? For nothing, it looked like. For pride and nothing else. That was the third mockery, and it was the one that bit deepest, because this time it came dressed as kindness. Hollis sent his boy over. A cheerful, thoughtless errand, the way children run them. The boy came trotting across the flat with a bucket of vain water sloshing at his side, up to the marsh gate, and he set it down there in the dust with a grin, and he sang out what his father had told him to say. Pa says here's some real water, Mr. Marsh, seeing as you're too proud to buy your own. Then he ran off laughing to tell his father he'd done it. A bucket of a rich man's water at a poor-looking man's gate. The whole valley's opinion of Elias Marsh, carried in a child's 2 hands, set down in the dirt as a joke. Elias came out and looked at the bucket. He did not touch it. He looked off across the flat at all that borrowed green, and his face did not change. But inside the house it near broke Ruth. That bucket did. She had held for weeks. She had made the breakfasts and turned her face to the wall and kept the faith, and now here was a child sent to mock them, and their own creek running low and clear at the bottom of the field while the whole world drank from the Baron's ditch and laughed. "Maybe you were wrong, Elias," she said it very quiet, at the window, not looking at him. She had never said it before. It cost her to say it now. Look at them, just look. Their fields, their water, all of it fine. Everyone fed and easy but us. Maybe there was no trap. Maybe he only meant to help, and you saw a snake in a garden hose, and we've lost every friend we had over your reading of a paper. It was the closest she ever came. And it was fair. From where she stood, at the window, in July, with the valley green and the neighbors gone and a mocking bucket at the gate, every visible fact said her husband had been a stubborn old fool. Elias came and stood by her. He did not argue the fields. He could not. They were green. He only looked out at them a while, and then he said the one thing he had left, the thing he had said to the creek in the dark, and would go on saying until the sky made him right, or made him wrong. "Wait for August," he said. "That's all. Wait for August, Ruth." And she looked at him, and something in the flat certainty of it, the same certainty that had cost them everything, steadied her in spite of the window and the bucket and the green. She did not understand it, but she had lived beside it 11 years, and she knew the difference between her husband being proud and her husband being sure, and this was the second thing, though it looked from outside exactly like the first. She turned back to her ledger. He went out to the field. And she did not say maybe you were wrong again. That night, while the valley slept easy on its borrowed water and told itself the good times had come to stay, Elias Marsh did a quiet thing, alone, that no one saw and no one would have understood if they had. He did not sit up scheming. There was no scheme in him. There was only the work a knowing man does with his hands when his mouth has run out of use. He took a lantern and a shovel down to the creek in the dark, and he went along his own headgate and his own ditch, and he made them ready. He cleared the intake where the creek fed his ditch, pulling out the drift and the muck a summer lays down, so that when he opened it the water would run clean and full and lose nothing. He deepened the ditch itself where it had silted, throwing the wet earth up on the bank, working slow and steady the way a big man works when there is no one to work for but the thing itself. He walked the line of it clear down to where it fed his stock pond, and he cleaned the pond's mouth so it would hold every drop it could hold, storing the low creek against the lower creek to come. Then, a storm had knocked his stake half loose, the wind and a night's rain working at the bank, and he found it leaning, the carved date tilted toward the water. He set it right. He drove it back down deep, deeper than before, and packed the earth around it hard with his heel, and he ran his thumb over the numbers he had cut. 1871. Still there. Still plain. He was not readying a weapon. He wasn't thinking of the men who had laughed at him, not with any heat. He was thinking, if he was thinking anything, of his family and of the water that would have to carry them through what was coming. And somewhere under that, not spoken, not even quite a thought, he was readying his one good right to carry more than his own. To carry whoever, come August, came walking up the dry flat to a fence they had mocked, with a bucket in their hand that would not fill anywhere else in the valley. But that was a long way off, and he did not let himself look at it. He just cleared his ditch and set his stake and stored his water, alone, by lantern light, while the crickets went and the borrowed greens slept. And the great diversion dam upriver held back a snowmelt that was already, though no man had yet said it aloud, beginning to run thin. He climbed back up to the house near midnight, boots wet, and stood a moment on the porch looking out over the whole quiet valley. 40 roofs, 40 families dreaming they were safe. The company canal a dull silver line under the stars, still running, but running. If a man knew how to look, a hair lower than it had run a week ago. It had not rained in 9 days. Elias Marsh stood on his porch and counted them, the way you count a thing you're afraid of. 9 days. And up in the high country where the snow had fed the river all spring, there was, he knew, not much snow left. The green fields below did not know it yet. The signers did not know it. Even the sky had not quite decided to announce it, but the water was starting to go. He could feel August coming across the flat like a shadow, with no cloud to cast it. And when it came, it would ask every man in the valley the one question the barbecue had let them forget. Whose water is it, really, when the river runs low? Elias knew the answer. It was carved in cottonwood at the creek's mouth, and folded in oilcloth in the tin box under the bed, and it was not the answer 40 families thought they had bought. He went in and lay down beside Ruth, and did not sleep for a long while, listening to the dry wind work at the eaves, waiting, the way you wait for a thing you have warned of and cannot stop, for the 10th morning with no rain. The 10th morning came, and it did not rain. Elias was up before Ruth. He stood at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched the light come gray over the flat. No cloud. Not one. The sky was the pale-washed blue of a thing that has decided something and will not be argued out of it. He drank his coffee. He put on his boots. He went down to the creek alone. The water was lower. Not much. A hand's width off the wet line on the bank. Maybe less. A man who did not know the creek would have called it full. But Elias knew the creek the way he knew Ruth's breathing in the dark, and it was dropping. He crouched at the intake of his own ditch and pulled a mat of dead grass loose and let the current take it. The stake stood at the mouth, where he had set it. The cottonwood had gone silver gray, and the numbers he had carved there were black in the grain. 1871. He put his hand flat on the wood the way another man might touch a headstone, and then he got up and went to work. That was the summer he worked alone. He cleared his ditch to the hard clay. He deepened the stock pond by 2 feet, hauling the wet earth out 1 barrow at a time until his back was a live coal and his hands had gone past blister to something harder. He cleaned the creek intake till the water ran into his ground clean and quick. He did it in the early cool, and again in the long gold evening, and in between he sat on his porch and watched the company canal run its dull silver line across the valley, and he counted the days. No rain by the middle of July. The creek dropped a finger's width, then 2. Up the valley the signers' fields still ran green, because the master canal still fed them, because Vane's dam still held the shrunken river and doled it out. From a distance the valley looked like a promise kept, 40 green squares under a hard blue sky. You had to stand where Elias stood, down at the water, to see the river going thin under all that green. Vane's cattle came down to the flats that month. More of them than the year before, redbacks moving through the sage like the valley belonged to them, which, on paper, more of it did every season. And the company's thirst climbed with the herd. The great headgate upriver took more and let less down, and the signers did not feel it yet, because the promise said guaranteed, and a promise feels like water right up until the day it isn't. Then the surcharges came. A boy rode the valley, 1 hot noon nailing paper, to fence posts. Elias found one on Hollis's line when he rode to look at the river. Back assessment, it said. Dry year delivery surcharge, per the schedule of the contract, payable before continued service. $3 the acre had been the price to sign. The paper on the post named a figure to keep the water flowing that was more than most of them had cleared off a good crop. It was in the contract. It had always been in the contract, folded down in the schedule under Clause 9 like a snake under a good flat rock, and no man had read that far, because Vane had read them the top of the paper and let their own wanting read the rest. Elias stood at Hollis's fence a long while with that paper in his hand. Then he tucked it back where he'd found it and rode home. It was not his to tear down. It was not his to explain anymore. He had explained it once, at a table, to a room that heard guaranteed water and nothing else, and a man who has been laughed off the church steps for telling the truth learns to stop offering it. But Hollis read it. Elias was mending the pole gate at dusk when he heard the horse. Hollis came down the lane slow, and he stopped his horse at the fence and did not get down. The light was going red behind him. He had his contract copy in his hand, folded and refolded till the creases had gone soft as cloth. Elias straightened up with the hammer still in his fist and waited. For a while, neither man said anything. A killdeer went crying across the darkening field. Hollis looked out over the marsh place, the wet ditch, the full pond, the green corn standing where every other man's borrowed green was starting, just starting, to pale at the tips. Then he looked down at the paper in his hand. "Elias," he said, and stopped. Elias waited. Hollis worked his jaw. His face in the red light was the face of a proud man with a stone in his throat. "Clause 9, he said finally. "I read it. Ruth's boy, the schoolteacher, read it to me twice." He stopped again. His hand tightened on the paper. That word, perpetuity, that mean what I think it means? And here was the moment. A smaller man would have taken it. A man with less patience or more hurt would have leaned on the fence and let the whole spring's mockery come back on Tom Hollis in a flood. Elias felt it rise in him, and he let it go by. He set the hammer down on the gatepost. "It means," he said quietly, "the water stopped being yours the day you signed." Hollis's throat moved. He looked away, out at the river, at the dark line of Vane's dam far up the valley holding back what used to run free to every one of them. His pride sat on him like a saddle he couldn't get off. He had led the laughing. He had stood on the steps and called this man too proud to take a neighbor's hand. And now he sat his horse at that man's fence with the proof in his fist that he had signed his family's water away in front of 40 cheering people, and the word for what he felt did not exist in any language a plain man carried. He could have asked. Elias saw him come right up to the edge of it. "Help me. What do I do?" The two of them alone in the red dusk, and the whole thing could have turned right there. But pride is a headgate too. It holds back what a man needs most. "Well," Hollis said. He gathered his reins. "Vane's got lawyers. Paper's paper." He tried to make it sound like nothing, and it came out like a man talking at his own funeral. He turned the horse. "You always did read too slow, Elias," he said, and it was meant to be the old mockery, and there was no meanness left in it at all, only a terrible tiredness. He rode off up the darkening lane and did not look back, and Elias stood at his gate and watched him go, and did not call after him, because a warning refused twice is not a warning the third time. It is just noise between the crickets. August came across the flat like the premise had promised, a shadow with no cloud to cast it. And Vane closed the gate. There was no announcement. That was the cruelty of it. One morning the master headgate on Antelope Creek stood open a hand's width to the master canal, and the next morning the ditch boss and 2 riders came down at first light and turned the great wheel and shut it flush. The shrunken river, all of it, everything the high country had left them, swung wholly into Vane's canal and ran to Vane's 11,000 fenced acres and Vane's cattle and Vane's little townsite of shacks and pens he called a town. The 40 green squares of the valley got nothing. They did not know for a day. Water in a ditch does not vanish. It stops feeding, and it sinks, and it goes. Slow. The way blood leaves a body. By the second day, the signers were out in their fields with their hats off, looking at ditches gone to damp mud. By the third day, the corn had begun to curl. By the end of that week, 1 week, 40 families' fields were browning tip to root under a sky that would not rain, and the master canal ran full and bright right past all of it, carrying their water to another man's grass. They rode to the company. Of course they did. 20 men, 30, dust and anger, down to the low sprawl of Vane offices by the dam. And the ditch boss came out onto the step with the contract in his hand, not Vane. Vane did not come out. Vane was a man who let paper do his talking now. And he held it up, and he read them. Clause 9. You conveyed your appropriative rights to the company, he said, in perpetuity. Says so. Right here. Every one of you put your mark to it. He turned a page. And you're in arrears on your assessments besides. Company's got no obligation to deliver to accounts in arrears. He folded the paper. You want water, gentlemen? You can lease it back. Company'll sell you water. Fair rate. Lease it back. Their own river. Sold back to them by the man who had taken it, at whatever price he named, forever. Because that is what perpetuity means, and not one of them had known the word until the fields were already dying. Tom Hollis was in that crowd. He did not shout with the rest. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and his face gone still. A man watching a thing he had seen coming and had been too proud to run from. And when the ditch boss went back inside and shut the door, and the other men milled and cursed and threatened a fight they could not win against paper, it was Hollis who said the thing that turned them. Marsh, he said. They looked at him. Elias Marsh never signed. His voice was rough. Elias Marsh's got the first water right on this creek. Older than Vane's dam. Older than any of ours. He looked up at them, 40 families' worth of ruin in his eyes. He told us. At the table. He read us that clause, and we laughed him home. He put his hat on. There's a water referee at Ellsworth. Territorial man. He rules on the record as filed. He looked toward the marsh place, small and green and impossible far off across the Browning Valley. Maybe it's the record that saves us. Since it sure wasn't the promise. And that was how the valley came to the stake. They came the way the beaten come, in 2s and 3s, hats in hand, up the lane they had not walked in a year. They came to the fence where the boy had left the bucket of company water in the dust as a taunt back in the green spring, and the bucket was still there, gone to rust, and no man could look at it. Ruth watched them come from the kitchen window, and her hands went to her mouth, because she had carried the shame of being the valley's outcast so long that she had half forgot there was another way to be looked at, and here it was coming up her lane with its hat off. Elias met them at the gate. He did not ask them in. Not yet. He stood with his hand on the top rail and heard them out, Hollis first, then others, the whole broken story of the closed headgate and the leased back water and the word none of them had understood. And when they were done, when they stood there in the dust, waiting to see if the man they'd mocked would turn them away the way they'd turned him away, Elias was quiet a while. Then he said, There's a referee at the territorial seat. Alden Poole. Straight as a plumb line. He'll come out and read the record in front of everybody, if enough of you ask him proper. He looked down the row of ruined faces. That's the only thing that'll answer this. Not fists, not begging Vane. The record. He took his hand off the rail. I filed mine in 71. It's on the register. It'll say what it says. He looked at Hollis. You want the record read, Tom, you go ask for it in writing, all of you, and you put your names to that the way you put your names to the other thing. And this time, he said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a hard old kindness, read it first. Alden Poole came out on a Tuesday. He was a spare gray man with spectacles and a leather satchel of the register's certified copies, and he had no more feeling in his face than a set of scales, which is exactly the man you want when the truth is the only thing that can save you. They held the hearing in the Ellsworth Crossing schoolhouse because it was the one building big enough, and because, though no man said it, it was the same room, near enough, where the contract had gone round the table a year and a half before. 40 families filled the benches. The same benches. The window on the west wall let in the long, dusty afternoon light, and the dust hung in it and turned, slow, the way dust does in a room where something is about to be decided. Vane sent his ditch boss and a lawyer in a town coat. Vane himself came late and stood at the back with his hat on and his thumbs in his vest and the certainty of 11,000 acres on his face. Because Cyrus Vane had never once in his life believed that a dirt farmer could read law, and he was not going to start believing it in a schoolhouse. Poole set his satchel on the plank table at the front. He put on his spectacles. He took out the record, sheet by certified sheet, and squared the edges. And then he began to read. And he read it the way the premise demanded it be read, family by family, name by name, so that every man in that room heard his own ruin spoken aloud in his own hearing. Thomas Hollis, Poole said. Southwest Quarter, Section 14. Water application filed under the Vane Consolidated Ditch, spring of 1878. He turned the page. Contains conveyance under Clause 9. Senior subordinates and conveys his appropriative right to the Vane Land and Cattle Company. In perpetuity. He looked up over his spectacles, once, at Hollis on the front bench. In law, Mr. Hollis, you hold no water right. You conveyed it. You are a tenant of the company at the company's rate. Hollis sat with his hat between his knees and his head down and took it. He had led the laughing once. He took the verdict now the same way, in front of the same people, and it was a hard thing to watch a proud man do. And he did it, which was the beginning, though no one knew it yet, of Tom Hollis becoming a better man than he had been. Amos Deaver's widow, Poole read, and Mrs. Deaver, the widow whose ground Elias had plowed one dry spring for nothing, who had signed because a widow alone is afraid, and who had never once in the whole shunning turned her back on Ruth, Mrs. Deaver put her face in her hands. Same conveyance, Poole said, not unkindly, because reality is not unkind, it is only true. Same clause. No standing. And so it went. Down the register. 40 times. Delaney, no standing. Pruitt, no standing. Vane's lawyer in his town coat nodded along with each one, half a smile on him, because each name Poole read was another acre bound to the company, and the lawyer was already counting them. And then Poole came to the end of the signers, and he set that stack of paper down, and he took up a single sheet older than the rest, gone soft and yellow at the folds, and the room did not know what it was. But Elias knew, and Vane at the back of the room did not yet know he should be afraid. Now, Poole said, there is one right on Antelope Creek that was not filed this spring. The room went still. Even the dust in the window seemed to stop. Elias Marsh, Poole read. Northeast Quarter, Section 11. Patented ground, proved 1867 through 78. He turned the certified copy to the light. Application for water on Antelope Creek. Priority date, June, 1871. He let that number sit in the room a moment. 1871. 7 years before Vane ever drove a stake. First appropriation of record on this stream, Poole said. First in time. First in right. He looked up, and for the first time in that whole reading his flat referee's face turned, deliberate, toward the back of the room, toward Cyrus Vane. Senior, Poole said, to the Vane Consolidated Ditch itself. Vane took his thumbs out of his vest. Under the doctrine of prior appropriation, Poole went on, and now he was not reading, he was speaking, and the plain law of it filled the room like water filling a dry ditch. The senior right is satisfied first. In a year of shortage, The junior right yields to the senior. Every drop. The company's dam is a junior diversion on this creek. He set the yellow paper down flat on the plank table under the dusty light. By law, the vein consolidated ditch must let Mr. Marsh's full measure pass its headgate before the company takes 1 inch for itself. The drought does not change that. The contract does not touch it, because Mr. Marsh is not a party to the contract. He conveyed nothing. He signed nothing. Poole took off his spectacles. He filed first. In 1871. And the record stands. You could hear the creak through the open schoolhouse door. That was how quiet it went. 40 families sat on the benches where they had cheered the paper, and they understood, all at once, and all together, the whole shape of the thing, that the man they had laughed off the church steps had not been a fool clinging to an old stake. He had been the only man in the valley who read the small print. His mark was not on the contract because he had known. He had told them, at the table, in this room, and they had laughed. And he had gone home and quietly refiled the one right in the valley that August could not touch. And now, in the ruin of everyone who mocked him, that right stood alone and unbroken like a stake carved with a date, because that is exactly what it was. Vane's lawyer stood up. He started to say something about the assessment schedule, about arrears, about the company's position, and Alden Poole let him get 4 words in and then closed him like a headgate. "Sit down," Poole said. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He was reality's mouthpiece, and reality does not raise its voice. "I've read your schedule, counselor. The dry year assessment isn't a fee. It's a lever. You buried a rate no farmer could pay under a clause no farmer could parse, and when the drought came, you called the fields into arrears you designed, and closed the gate you always meant to close." He gathered the certified copies square. This hearing finds the Vane Land and Cattle Company enjoined from diverting any water on Antelope Creek in derogation of the senior right of Elias Marsh. The company's headgate will pass the Marsh measure first, in full, this season and every season. He looked at Vane and the 2 eldest powers in that valley, the law and the money, met each other's eyes across the room full of the ruined, and the territorial recorder, Poole said, will be reviewing how these 40 signatures were obtained. "I'd have your counsel here ready for that, Mr. Vane. The press already is." There was a man from the territorial paper on the last bench with a notebook, and he was writing fast. Cyrus Vane put his hat on. He had come in with the certainty of 11,000 acres, and he went out the schoolhouse door without a word. Because there was no word, the whole engine of his valley, the dam and the canal and the promise and the perpetuity, had been built on the one thing that turned out not to be true, that no dirt farmer could read law. And the dirt farmer had read it in 1871, before Cyrus Vane ever saw the Antelope Valley, and had simply, quietly, waited by his creek for August to prove it. They went out of the schoolhouse into the long gold evening, and it was Hollis who came to Elias in the yard. He came with his hat in his hands. Behind him the valley stood in the low light, brown where the green had died, and away down the flat you could just see the marsh place, the one wet ditch, the one field still standing. Hollis stopped in front of Elias and could not, for a moment, get anything out. All the loud words he'd spent on this man on the church steps had come home, and he stood in the wreck of them. "Elias," he said. His voice broke on it. "I stood on those steps. I said you'd sooner die of thirst than take a neighbor's hand." He looked down at his hat. "And you'd already dug your ditch to save the lot of us and never said a word about it." He couldn't look up. "I don't know how a man lives with what I Tom," Elias said it easy. He put out his hand, the work-hard hand that had cleaned the creek intake alone all summer, and he laid it on Tom Hollis's shoulder, and it stopped the man cold. "It was always the paper," Elias said. "Not you. Not one of you. The paper." He looked out at the Browning Valley, at the 40 families coming slow out of the schoolhouse into the evening, at the ruin a single unread clause had made. A man reads it, or he doesn't. I read it. He took his hand back. That's the whole of it. And then Elias Marsh did the thing that the whole story had been walking toward, and he did it the way the premise asked, not as triumph, as decency. He walked down to his creek in the last of the light, with the valley following at a distance, because they could not help it, and he put his hands on the wheel of his own headgate, his senior right, the one measure of water on Antelope Creek that Cyrus Vane's dam was now bound by law to let pass. And he opened it. Not a little. All the way. He turned the wheel until his ditch ran full, and then he broke his own bank at the low corner the way he had done in dry years before any of this, and he let his senior water, his water, proven, filed, first in time, first in right, run out of his ground and down into the dead ditches of the men who had mocked him. It crawled into the cracked clay of Hollis's field. It went down the valley slow and bright in the gold light into the browning corn, water where there had been no water, from the one man they had frozen out, and the 40 families stood on the bank and watched their fields drink, and not one of them could speak. Ruth came down and stood beside him. She had carried the shame of the outcast so long, the church pews with the space around them, the boy at the gate with the taunting bucket, the year of being the valley's fool. She put her hand in her husband's, and she did not say, "I'm sorry I doubted you." And she did not need to. She'd said, "Wait for August." He'd said, "Wait for August." It was August. She just held his hand and watched his water run out to the neighbors, and up on the far ridge a rider from the referee's office was nailing the territorial injunction to the great headgate of the Vane consolidated ditch, the paper white against the dark timber. And the two things happened in the same gold frame, the water crawling back into the valley's dead ditches, and the law going up on the Baron's own dam. That is nearly the end of it. Let me give you the last of it plain, the way the old hands tell it, one dry line for each of them, 6 months on. It was autumn. The creek ran low the way it always runs low in the fall, but Elias Marsh's ditch was wet, because a senior right is wet in a dry year. That is the whole meaning of it. That is what the word senior costs, and what it's worth. The corn was in. Ruth's kitchen window glowed yellow in the early dark, and along the lane the neighbors' fences were mended, and there was no bucket in the dust at the gate anymore. Someone had carried it off. Quiet, and no one ever said who. Tom Hollis kept his ground. He leased his water back from no one, because the referee's ruling had unwound the worst of it, and what it hadn't unwound Hollis paid off slow, and he became, in his middle years, the man who read the small print for the whole valley, who stood up at every meeting and said, "Read it. Read all of it. Before you put your name." Someone asked him once, years later, why he was so particular. "I signed a thing I didn't read," Tom Hollis said, in front of 40 people, and laughed at the one man who did. "I read every line now." That was all he ever said about it. It was enough. Mrs. Deaver kept her farm. Elias plowed her lower field again that fall, for nothing, the way he had before, and she brought Ruth back into the church pew and sat beside her where the empty space used to be, and the empty space was never there again. And Cyrus Vane. The territorial paper ran the story the way Poole had promised it would, the buried clause, the designed assessment, the closed gate, the whole engineered land grab laid out in print for the territory to read. The reckoning came the way it comes to a thing built on a lie, not in one blow, but in the slow failure of the trust it had counted on. The Vane consolidated ditch went into receivership before the next June rise. And the 11,000 fenced acres, the empire built to make every rancher a tenant of his own river, went up for sale by order of the court, handled, by a turn the valley savored in silence, by the same referee, Alden Poole, who read the record straight and let the small print fall on the man who wrote it. 6 months on, Elias Marsh walked his fence line in the low autumn light, past the mouth of Antelope Creek where the cottonwood stake stood gray and true with its black numbers in the grain. 1871, The same stake he'd driven the night they laughed him home, standing now like it had stood the whole time. Through the mockery and the good green spring, and the closing of the gate, and the reading of the record, unmoved. Because a true thing does not have to move. It only has to be there when August comes. A promise, the old hands say, is only ever as honest as its smallest clause. Vane wrote his promise in big warm words across the top of the paper, guaranteed, every season, drought or no. And he wrote the truth of it down small, in the 9th clause, in the part no tired, hopeful man would read. 40 families signed the big words. One man read the small ones. And when the river ran thin, and the sky would not answer, and every promise in the valley came due at once, the only water that ran was the water of the man they mocked, because he had done the one thing none of them would do. He read it first. That's the story of Elias Marsh, and Antelope Creek, and the water that ran uphill against a barren because an old clerk kept his filing and drove his stake, and waited. If it found you tonight, do an old man a kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far this old valley travels.